today's episode, we're gonna talk about the basics of photography and how to use your camera. Because I remember when I first bought my DSLR, there definitely was not a lot of content like this, and I had to learn the slow and hard way. And that meant reading the instruction manual. That's right, I literally bought my first DSLR, picked up this instruction manual, and just started reading through page by page. And let's just say it was pretty dang tedious. You can only imagine how many times I dozed off and started napping during the whole process. So to save you the time and trouble of having to read through this instruction manual, I'm gonna be teaching you guys in this episode the main things you need to know when you first start photography. So when you're buying your first DSLR or mirrorless camera, there's often three mistakes that people make. The first is you end up spending all your money buying the camera body, but you end up just getting a kit lens. The second mistake is shooting in automatic mode. And the third mistake is shooting JPEG and not RAW. And I'm guilty of all these three mistakes, so don't feel so bad about yourself if you're making those mistakes or have made these mistakes. But the reason why these are huge mistakes is basically you're not getting the full potential out of your camera. When you buy a mirrorless camera with just the kit lens, most often the kit lens's f-stop is only from 3.5 to 5.6, which means that you're not gonna be able to get nice depth of field or bokeh, or in just normal people's terms, that blurry, nice background that you're looking for when you're shooting portraits of people. Even by just spending $100 to $150 on a basic 50mm portrait lens, it's gonna give you the access to have an aperture of 1.8, which is gonna give you that nice shallow depth of field when you're taking portraits of people. And the second mistake, shooting in automatic mode, you're essentially allowing your camera to decide the settings for you rather than you being in control and deciding what kind of end product you want with your photos. And that's the best part of a mirrorless camera compared to something like an action camera or a mobile phone, is that you're in control of the settings, meaning you get to decide what the final photo is gonna look like. This could be, for example, having a really slow shutter speed in order to get really nice star shots, or maybe you want that long shutter speed so you can, blur out a waterfall to get that really dreamy look, or maybe you just want a really sharp, clean photo of a wildlife animal, like a bird flying, so you want to have a really high shutter speed. All these settings are in your control in order to get that kind of photo. So that's why you want to be shooting in manual mode and not automatic. And the third mistake is shooting in JPEG. A lot of people, they don't realize the difference between JPEG and RAW, but when you're shooting with your DSLR or mirrorless camera, you want to shoot in RAW because that's going to give you the ultimate flexibility in post to edit the photo the way you want it to be. So instead of having the camera decide what settings are gonna be baked into the photo like a JPEG, with a RAW, you can decide afterwards a lot more what kind of exposure you want, how much contrast, the white balance. All these settings are for you to decide then in post. Okay, now that we've got those basic mistakes out of the way, what is the main thing you should learn when you first buy your DSLR or mirrorless camera and you wanna learn about photography? Well, the main thing you want to learn is the exposure triangle, which means understanding shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Because when you understand these three things, it's going to allow you to be in control of the exposure of your photos, the depth of field, and the amount of motion blur that you have in each photo. So before we break down shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, if you are enjoying this video so far and you're a new person to this channel, make sure you like and subscribe because I would love to have you a part of this community. So when you're switching the dial on your camera to manual mode, you're essentially going to decide all the settings for your camera and the photos you want to take, which means you get to decide the shutter speed, the aperture, and ISO. Now, everyone has their own preference in which order they choose these settings. I personally prefer choosing first the ISO, then my aperture, and last my shutter speed, but people might choose these in different orders depending on their style of shooting. So the first setting, ISO. What does that even mean? ISO basically refers to the camera's sensor's sensitivity to light. And this ISO number is, measured in a numerical value. You got ISO 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, and just keeps going on up all the way up to ridiculous numbers nowadays in cameras. And the higher the number, the more sensitive your sensor is going to be to the light, which basically just means the higher the number, the more light you get. Now at this point, you're probably thinking, well, should I just crank it super high just so I have the maximum amount of light coming into my sensor, which is gonna give me a great photo? Well, not exactly. Yes, when you increase the ISO, you do get more light, but as well, the higher the number, the more you're introducing grain or noise or artifacting, which just basically means the image is not as clean anymore and doesn't look as good. For example, let's look at a photo at ISO 100 to 3200, 6400, and all the way up to 409 something thousand ISO. You can clearly see a difference in quality in the photos, even though I'm getting more light at a higher ISO, but at the same time, I'm losing quality when it comes to the digital noise introduced. So this is a little bit of balancing act because there's times where you're shooting a darker situation and you maybe need to increase the ISO, but you don't want to increase it so high to a ridiculous number that the photo is just not going to be usable anymore. So my way of deciding which ISO I need to use is based on a few things. If I'm shooting outside in the middle of the daylight, I don't need any extra light, so I'm going to keep the ISO as low as possible at ISO 100. But now if I'm shooting in a darker environment, I'm gonna increase the ISO necessary so that I can get enough light in order to have a high enough shutter speed to get a nice sharp photo. And that's maybe at like 1/160th. Now everyone has their own preference. Someone might go for a little lower shutter speed, or they might prefer a little bit faster shutter speed, but around there is where I wanna be. So I wanna have high enough ISO in order to be able to take a fast enough photo in order for it to be sharp still. It's a little bit of a balancing act, and you're gonna understand more when we talk about shutter speed last. So once I've decided my ISO, then I decide my aperture. And aperture basically refers to the opening in your lens allowing light into your sensor. And the way it's defined is that the larger the aperture, the larger the opening, the more open the lens is gonna be. So at a number like 1.8, it's gonna be very wide open, whereas then an f16, for example, it's gonna be a very small hole, letting in very little amount of light. So basically, more wide open, higher f-stop number like 1.8, you're gonna get a lot more light in, whereas a smaller f-stop number like f16, it's gonna be much smaller, letting in a lot less light. And then as well, the f-stop affects your depth of field. So having it wide open at, for example, 1.8 f-stop, it's gonna be very shallow depth of field. It's gonna be very blurry behind your subject, whereas if you have a higher f-stop, there's gonna be a very, deep depth of field, meaning everything is in focus. Now, where this comes to play, a lot of times when you're doing portrait photography, you wanna have wide open to get that nice depth of field when you're taking portraits of someone. And then if you're doing landscape photography, for example, you wanna have a much lower f-stop like f16, or I probably would do like f5.6 to 6.3 in order to get a nice sharp photo. Some things to keep in mind, for example, back in the days when I shot a lot of weddings, when you're doing, a group shot and you have people in the front row and then the second row, you wanna make sure that you don't have too high of an f-stop like 1.8 because the front row will be in focus, but then already the back row is out of focus. So make sure you have a higher f-stop for that and make sure that both rows are in focus. Small things to think about, but really important. So yeah, when you're deciding your aperture, two things to think about. How much light do you need in that situation? And as well, how much depth of field do you want your photo? Do you want just a small sliver to be in focus, or do you want the whole photo to be in focus? Those are the two things you gotta think about when choosing your aperture. And the last setting that we need to figure out when you're taking photos is your shutter speed. And shutter speed refers to how long the shutter opens and closes, allowing light to enter into your sensors. So for example, if you have a really fast shutter, it's gonna sound like this. Whereas if you do a slow shutter of maybe 1/5 of a second, it's gonna be like this. You can already hear it. This one sounds a lot slower and not happening as fast, meaning the shutter is open longer and it's allowing in more light. So basically with the shutter speed, the way it works, it affects two things. The faster the shutter, the less time it's gonna be open, meaning you get less light in. Whereas if it's slower shutter, it's gonna allow more light in, meaning it's gonna be a brighter photo. And then it's gonna affect the amount of motion blur that you're seeing in your photo. So for example, if you have a very fast shutter speed, it's gonna quickly take the photo, meaning there's gonna be very little motion blur. Whereas if you do a slow shutter speed, then you're gonna get more motion blur. So that's where you get shots like, the blurry, dreamy looking waterfall. The person's gonna be taking a slow shutter speed with a tripod, and it's gonna blur all that motion. Whereas, for example, when you see a really sharp, in focus photo of a bird flying, that's taken with a very high shutter speed because they gotta be able to freeze that moment. So to sum up shutter speed, it's basically controlling the amount of light coming into the sensor depending on how fast or how slow the shutter is opening and closing, and as well, it's affecting the amount of motion blur in your photos. So that is the exposure triangle in a nutshell. That's shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Using all these three things together, you're able to control the exposure of your photo, you're able to control how much depth of field you have, and how much motion blur you have in your photo. Now you are ready to go out and shoot and be in control of what type of photo you want the end result to be. And honestly, the only way to learn these things is just to go out and shoot. I know right now it might feel a little bit confusing, but the more you shoot, it's gonna become second nature to you. Honestly, whenever I'm picking up a camera, I don't even really think anymore about what shutter speed or aperture or ISO I'm shooting. It's just second nature. So trust me, just go out and shoot a whole lot, and all this information is gonna get internalized. Also, if you did enjoy this video, feel free to watch my other videos about photography. This video right here is great to learn about composition and probably the next step for you to learn when it comes to a beginner photographer learning how to take great photos. Thanks guys for watching all the way to the end of this video. Appreciate you guys and have a great day.